There we go. All right. Cool. How's the audio looking? My high quality mic just decided to stop working seconds before the stream started, so we're using the webcam mic. So how's the quality? Is it bad? All right. Well, we'll give it a minute or two for people to get in. We just went live. Notifications are probably going out. In the meantime, how's everybody doing today? How are y'all doing? We've got a big event going on in Charleston tomorrow, where all 4 candidates for United States Senate on the Democratic side are going to be on the same stage at the same time, which is the first time it's happened since, well, ever. So it's big news. It's going to be fun. They say that it's not a debate, that it's an open discussion, like a town hall, but it's in a very much a debate format with a certain number of minutes to speak and then a certain number of minutes to respond and rebuttals and all that. But I'm looking forward to it. So, with everything that's going on in the news with Iran and the bombing of their nuclear enrichment sites, there's a lot of people that seem to not really know what they're talking about when they discuss this. And since a lot of the discussion about uranium and about radioactivity is either so complex or so basic to where it's like magic happens, or you're breaking down like the quantum level. I figured that we should take some time to talk about uranium enrichment, how uranium works. Okay. But I figured we should talk about this and sort of clarify things and answer some questions that people have, because there's a simple way to understand. Here, that should help the audio levels just a little bit. It looks like we were peaking a whole bunch, so this should help the audio quality. But I wanted to take some time to break down some of the stuff so that people understand what they're talking about when they say 60% enrichment, or when they say they were 2 weeks away from having a bomb, and all of that. It's correct to say that they've been 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb for 20 years, but it's not necessarily a lie to say that they're 2 weeks away, and I wanted to get into why that is, just so that everybody can have a better understanding of what's going on when we talk about what's going on in Iran and their nuclear program, and the nuclear program here and abroad, and why it's so difficult to enrich uranium. Let's see. Give me just a moment to make sure everything's set up so that we're ready to go. And we're going to switch over to here so that I can draw up some examples as we're going. So just to confirm, everything's good on the audio end. Everybody say hi in chat so that I know that chat's working, please. Hello, thank you. So, I think a good place to start is to talk about what radioactivity is. A radioactive isotope is an atom that is so large that it starts to fall apart on its own and it turns into other atoms. The nucleus itself has pieces that break off, and when that breaks off, it gives off energy. One of the main ones that uranium gives off is an alpha particle. And an alpha particle is 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So it's essentially a helium nucleus. And it just flies out at a high rate of speed. And that's what radiation is these particles that get shot out of the nucleus of an atom that is essentially so large that it's unstable. And there's multiple different isotopes, which are how many different neutrons are in the nucleus, because the number of protons determines what the atomic number is, and the number of neutrons sort of helps determine the mass. And that the number of neutrons can fluctuate, and that's where you get isotopes. And certain isotopes are radioactive. And keep in mind that there's lots of different kinds of radiation. Light is radiation. When you put something in the microwave, microwaves are radiation. But they're not ionizing radiation, which is the stuff we think about when we think about it damaging your cells and giving you cancer. And that's the stuff that damages your DNA and damages your tissues. So, I just lost my train of thought. But ionizing radiation is the stuff that's really dangerous, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about radioactive isotopes that are decaying, is the ionizing radiation that can actually hurt you. Thank you, Madam Hooch, for the follow, and thank you, Colin Palmetto, for following as well. But there's multiple different isotopes of uranium. They're all radioactive. The 2 that are the important ones are uranium-238, which is the vast majority of uranium. I think it's greater than 99%. And the other is uranium-235. And uranium-235 is the useful stuff. So let's go ahead and bring it over here. We've got uranium. Whoops. Hang on. So, we've got uranium-238. That's terrible. It's terrible handwriting, but I'm doing it with a mouse, so forgive me. And that equals 99% of 99% of all of the uranium that you're going to find is uranium-238. The useful stuff is uranium-235. And that's what you're looking for. But that equals 0.7% of the uranium that you'd find in natural uranium ore. So when we're talking about enrichment, what they're talking about is removing uranium-238 and trying to get as much uranium-235 as possible. The issue with doing that, and the difficulty with doing that, is that you're talking about taking uranium atoms and removing them from a batch of uranium atoms. So it's like trying to remove a specific needle from a needle stack, finding needle in a needle stack. As you can imagine, it's quite difficult, and the process can only be done at scale. I'm not going to go too deep into the enrichment process because there's not much to gain from learning it for the purposes of what we're discussing today. But you essentially expose uranium to a chemical reaction because although it is a metal, it is still chemically reactive. That chemical reaction turns it into a gas. You put it into a series of centrifuges, which will take the heavier 238, and as it spins, it moves the heavier 238 out to the sides, and it starts to scrape the uranium-235 out of the center. And you repeat that process repeatedly in order to get as much uranium-235 and essentially purify it as much as you can. And that is, in general, the enrichment process. Now, in order to make a useful amount of uranium-235, there's a couple numbers that, in order to make a useful amount for, let's say, a nuclear power plant, you want to get between 3 and 5% enrichment, which means of the mass of atoms that you have, 5% of them are uranium-235, and the rest are uranium-238. And that is useful for a nuclear fuel rod, because, and here's the reason why uranium-235 is special. When uranium-238 breaks down, it breaks down by removing an alpha particle and becoming a thorium atom. But uranium-235 can get cracked in half. And when uranium-235 breaks in half, it becomes two different atoms, and it releases 3 neutrons. And that's important. So we'll have, here's our, hang on. Here's our uranium atom. And when that cracks in half, we get 3 neutrons that get shot out from it. Now, you can crack or fission a uranium atom by shooting a neutron at it. So if you hit a neutron at it, you get 3 additional neutrons. So you can see how if you have a series of uranium-235 atoms, if each one of these, if each one of these cracks another one, you can see how the chain reaction goes. And that's how you get a nuclear bomb. That's how you get a bomb, is by having this runaway chain reaction of fission, because each time that this happens, you lose mass because that mass is converted directly into energy. That's where E equals mc squared comes from. That's the energy equals the mass that's being converted into energy times the speed of light squared. That's what that equation means. And so as you convert some of the mass into energy, you get massive and massive amounts of energy poured out all at once in a runaway chain reaction. So that is a bomb. But if you wanted to make, give me a second. We're going to wipe this clean real quick. If you wanted to make a nuclear fuel rod, you can do that too by having a line of your uranium-235 atoms. And you do basically the same process. We're going to shoot a neutron at this one, and it's going to split and make 3 neutrons. But we can put what are called control rods. So we'll set this up here like this, and these are going to be our control rods. So as this goes through and cracks this open, this uranium-235 atom, it's going to split, and it will send one of its neutrons up into the control rod, another one of its neutrons up into the control rod, and the other one straight forward, causing this one to crack, and that'll continue. And so instead of it getting exponentially more powerful as time goes on, we have a steady, sustained output of energy because we're capturing the neutrons. And if we wanted it to ramp up and we wanted it to have more power output, we can remove some of the control rods to allow more neutrons to proliferate, which increases the output. And that's essentially how a nuclear power plant works. You surround this whole thing in water in order to capture all of that heat that it gives off in order to create steam. You use that steam in steam turbines, and you have a clean, long-lasting form of energy. This is a nuclear power plant in a nutshell. Give me just a moment, and we'll wipe this clean. So that is, it's useful to have uranium because you can make nuclear fuel cells out of it. But you only need 5% enrichment in order to do that. Once you go too much higher above 5%, you start getting into a realm where it becomes more and more difficult to control the nuclear reaction that you have going on in your reactor. So what Iran has done is they've enriched 400 kilograms of uranium to 60% enrichment, which is about 90% of the enrichment process. Getting the last 20% to 30% from there is A weapons grade needs to be around 90. I don't know if I said that. Weapons grade needs to be about 90%. So you've got a nuclear fuel rod that wants to be at 2 to 5%. But a weapons needs to be 90% or greater. And you don't want to get too much greater, because somebody asked, what if you make it 100% enrichment? What does that do? And well, that goes critical on its own. That becomes so unstable that it wants to become a bomb without your input, which isn't what you want. And I don't think we can physically get it to 100% enrichment because of practical reasons. But ignoring that. So Iran got their nuclear stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, which is weird because it's not nearly enough for the 90% that is weapons grade. However, it's also way too much to be practical for a nuclear power plant. So it seems like the reason that they would want to do that is in order to, if they needed to, make a quick race to get the last 90% of their enrichment done. So when they say that Iran is 2 weeks away from having what they need to make a nuke, they're talking about the 2-week process that it would take to make the minimum amount of uranium for a nuclear weapon into 90%. And that means that if they used 100% of their infrastructure dedicated to sprinting to 90% enrichment as quickly as possible, that's how long it would take. It would be about 2 weeks or a month, based on some of the figures that are out there. But it seems very clear to me that Iran wasn't very interested in getting that, finishing that enrichment, because they hadn't done it. They'd been sitting on 60% enrichment stockpile for over a decade. So while they're not lying when they say that they're 2 weeks away from having a nuclear weapon, they are being very misleading and very disingenuous, because it's not like there's some guy sitting in a basement that's tinkering away and in just 2 more weeks he's going to finally have figured out how the bomb works. They know how it works, they know what they're doing, and they've made an active decision not to fully enrich their uranium. The frightening part is the idea that now that they've been attacked, they might have a reason to do those last bit of enrichment. They might have a reason to finish off their nuclear program. And that's not great. We don't want countries like Iran to have nuclear weapons, because in regions that are unstable, it's easy to say, like, these people can be trusted with a nuclear weapon now, but if the region is unstable and that government can fall and a sort of messianic cult could come in and obtain possession of those, you now have a very unstable, radical element that may not care about the future of the human race that is now in possession of nuclear weapons. So does anybody have any questions before I move on? I know that that's a lot all at once, but I think that it's important to understand this, because there's lots of people that will use the technical sounding jargon to scare you or to trick you into thinking that things are more dire than they can. Basically, whatever helps them. If feeling more safe and secure is their objective, they'll be able to use the science and the language of science to convince you that everything's fine. But if their objective is to scare you into supporting, violent action, much like the current administration is doing, then they can use the 2 weeks number to say, like, oh, it was only a matter of time before they had nukes and they ended the world, which isn't true. They've made an active decision not to finish their nuclear arsenal. I don't know why. Another thing that's interesting that I think is relevant to today's issues is that we, as a species all across the world, have sort of decided not to invest in the R&D that it takes to improve the uranium enrichment process. And one of the reasons for that is the only way to enrich enough uranium to be useful is to do it at scale, because you're talking about such a small percentage of a uranium ore is useful. The only way to get a useful amount of, whether it's a fuel rod or whether it's a weapons program, of uranium-235 is to have a massive structure that's fully dedicated to enriching as much as possible. So the fact that you need so much of an infrastructure, and you need so many centrifuges, you need so much power, you need so much physical space, that keeps people out of having a nuclear weapon. That's how the plans for building a nuke can just be on the internet. Like the schematics or the blueprints for one can just be available on the internet, and we don't have to worry about somebody randomly being able to make one. It's because even if you know how to make the device itself, you're not going to be able to make the uranium-235 enriched to the point that it's ever useful without the scale of a government. And that's how inspectors can do their jobs effectively. So when we say we're going to send inspectors over there, and we're going to make sure that the inspectors are checking their facilities and making sure that they're complying with the treaties or the nuclear deals, we know that those inspectors are being effective because these kinds of facilities are it's like trying to hide a server farm. They're massive, they take massive amounts of power, and they have heat signatures that you can see from space. It's not something that you can hide in a basement or somebody can take home and do in their apartment. It's not something that can be hidden, at least not very easily. So we can trust that sending inspectors is an effective way to monitor somebody's nuclear program, because the scale required for it to be an effective program means that it has to be large enough to where inspectors would be able to do that job. So if you remember back in the Bush administration, when they were saying, oh, well, they're just hiding it from the inspectors, and there were a bunch of people that were arguing against that, the argument against that is they can't have a nuclear program that is small enough to be hidden from an inspection. And that's likely an argument. We're seeing a lot of the same playbook from the last time when we went into Iraq. We're seeing a lot of the same playbook again that the Republicans did, and so it's very likely that they'll be saying that they're trying to trick inspectors coming up. But you now know better, and you know that that's nonsense, that they're just saying to try to manipulate the voter base into supporting a foreign war again, so that it can help them out in the midterms. So, by the way, you can buy uranium online if you're interested. I think the legal maximum amount of uranium that you're allowed to own is 1 gram, which isn't very much. But feel free to go ahead and check out some uranium prices, and you can get your hands on some uranium ore. My uranium ore is right up there on the top of my desk. I have a little shelf over here on my hutch. And my uranium ore sample, it only gives off alpha particles. Alpha particles only have the ability to penetrate a few inches of air, and they barely go through the dead layers of your skin. So it's perfectly safe to hold on to a sample of uranium ore. It's not going to hurt you. Beta and gamma particles are the two forms of ionizing radiation that are really dangerous. Gamma is the stuff that's so powerful it can go through your entire body and not hurt you. It's so energetic that it has to be slowed down before it can actually hurt you, which that can be slowed down by going through air a certain distance, or it can be slowed down by going through more of your body. But just remember that radiation is like little beads that are getting thrown out. It's not like a field that hovers around you. The problem is when things get extremely radioactive and you have stuff that's very high on the radioactivity chart, there's such a scatter of it. It's such a full cloud that it might as well be an entire field, like a magnetic field. The way I was explaining it to somebody the other day is each time that a radioactive particle hits you, let's say that there's a 1 in a trillion chance that the ionizing radiation affects you in some sort of negative way. Because we're constantly being bombarded by ionizing radiation from space in the form of cosmic rays. But we're not typically harmed by it. And if there is any damage that's done, it's usually so minor that our body just repairs it. And that's what they mean when they say that there's a minimum exposure rate, is each time that you're exposed to a bit of ionizing radiation, you're rolling that dice for that 1 in a trillion chance. And so if you have one exposure every 20 minutes in the form of a year, you're probably going to be fine. But if you have 20 trillion exposures per second, those are really bad odds, and you're probably going to have a significantly you're going to have a bad day. And that's where these radiation, it's essentially a statistics game. It's a law of large numbers game, where it's extremely unlikely for a small dose of radiation to be harmful to you in the long run, while it's extremely likely for a high dose of radiation to be harmful to you very soon and quite quickly. But beta and gamma radiation are the two that are the most dangerous. Uranium ore just gives out alpha almost exclusively. There are stray beta particles from now and then, but most of the time it's just giving off alpha particles, and it's perfectly safe as long as you don't eat it or something. If you consume it, that's super bad for you, because then you're capturing 100% of the radiation with your body and your internal organs, and you don't have the protection of the dead layers of skin and things that will stop it from being able to penetrate much further. And gamma radiation is mostly what you see in the form of nuclear waste or nuclear fallout. That's some of the later on down the chain fission products, which we won't go into too much. But going back to nuclear power plants, let's see if I'm going to draw up a diagram here for a second. This is going to be a somewhat crude drawing, so here we go. So if this is a nuclear reactor that I've hastily thrown together. The blue is a tank of water, and these green rods are the control rods. Or I'm sorry, the nuclear fuel rods. So you can create, you can control the reaction by having these control rods that can be moved up and down. So you can take this control rod here, and there would be one in between each of these fuel rods along here. By moving these control rods out, you're increasing the reaction, because the control rods are things that are absorbing those neutrons. So as those neutrons scatter out, if they find another uranium-235 atom, that uranium-235 atom will split and give off 3 more neutrons. And then those neutrons will fly out until they either hit a control rod or another uranium-235. So by removing the control rods, or by partially removing them, we're allowing more and more of these neutrons to flow around and bounce around until they hit something. Now, throw in the boron. Yes. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, we do need moderators. So when the neutrons initially come out, they're actually moving so quickly that they need to be slowed down a little bit before they can hit a uranium-235 atom and actually create the reaction. That's a gross oversimplification, but you have moderators which are in there as well. And the Chernobyl reactor famously had moderators that were permanently part of the reaction chamber in the form of graphite. And their control rods were graphite tipped. So as you would remove the control rod, the moderator would take its place and speed up the reaction even more. And famously, when Chernobyl started to have a meltdown and it started to have a runaway because of xenon, which I might get into a little bit later. We'll see how interested people are in it. When they hit the scram button, which is supposed to drop all of the nuclear or all of the control rods in as fast as possible all at once, the first thing that entered the reactor was a whole bunch of graphite, which acts as a moderator, and it drastically sped up the reaction and caused a complete runaway and ended up jamming the control rods in that place so that the only thing that was affecting it was the moderator, and there was nothing to slow it down because it has a positive void coefficient, which is a bad idea. But by moving these control rods in and out, you can control the level of the reaction. So if you need more heat in order to get more energy out of your turbines, yes, I am some kind of science believer. I do believe in science, only because things like my cell phone and internet and nuclear reactors actually work. So the practicality of science makes it pretty difficult to argue with. I lost my train of thought again. But the heat that's given off by these reactions will be captured by water. That water goes through steam turbines, and that's how you generate the electricity. So if you want more power, oh no, you're fine. You're fine. If you want more power, you just remove the control rods, and that generates more heat. Now, if you remove them all the way, eventually the uranium can get so hot, because keep in mind the heat is coming from the uranium atoms themselves, and so the uranium itself is heating up. Now, if you don't control the reaction, it can get so hot that it reaches its own melting point, at which point you don't have these neat and controlled rod-shaped sources of fuel. Now you have liquid in a vat of water. You have molten, what is essentially lava in the form of water. That's what a meltdown is. A meltdown is not an explosion. It's not. It's simply just a runaway nuclear reaction that creates enough heat that it melts the uranium fuel itself. And in the case of Chernobyl, the reaction was so potent that it melted through the floor and started to melt concrete. It melted the chamber that it was in, completely decimated the core. Now, Chernobyl did explode, but Chernobyl exploded because of a chemical explosion. The initial explosion was one of pressure from the massive amount of steam that had been created. It had gotten so hot that it disassociated the hydrogen and oxygen atoms in the water from each other. That caused the core itself to explode like a pressure chamber. Then fresh oxygen flew into the now exposed core, and a hydrogen-oxygen explosion occurred. So it was a chemical explosion that blew the core up and blew the roof of the building off and all of that. But it was not a nuclear explosion at Chernobyl. But that chemical explosion did throw fissile material and nuclear waste all over the Chernobyl scene and exposed essentially everybody in the power plant to incredible amounts of radiation all at once. But that reaction, that nuclear reaction, got so hot that it started to melt concrete. You're essentially talking about lava that is also radioactive. And that became, we've now named that material corium. And it's considered the most dangerous man-made material in existence. And there's famously, I'm sure somebody in chat knows, about the elephant's foot, which is this massive solidified chunk of corium that has melted through the floor and into the basement chambers of of Chernobyl, and it's sort of solidified in this foot-shaped, this elephant foot-shaped glob at the bottom. Yes, the show was incredible. They take a couple liberties in what actually happened, but not in a way that's like egregious. For instance, I'm forgetting his name, but the main scientist, the guy with the glasses, he's first of all he does a terrific job in that movie. But there's the female scientist that joins him. She is sort of the embodiment of dozens and dozens of scientists that all worked with him. So it wasn't just these three people, it was dozens and hundreds of people, but for the purposes of a show, to sort of combine all of those individuals into one person that sort of represents all of them is a great way to communicate the gist of what happened. I think they did a fantastic job. I don't think that any of the liberties that they took were dishonest with what had occurred. The only thing that they don't say is that those three divers, if you remember the three divers that went down, they don't say what happened to those guys. All three of them lived. They lived quite long lives. I don't think any of them died of cancer. So, know that. Know that those divers survived. Yes, Jared Harris as Valery Legasov. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but it's Russian, so... Yeah, all three of those divers lived. And the show makes it seem like there's a 0% chance that they made it. In actuality, they did. And I think the show does a great job of capturing just how utterly terrifying going into the core of a melting down a nuclear reactor is. But yes, the HBO show is terrific. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's just called Chernobyl. And he gives a good explanation of why the RMK reactor failed. And I already mentioned earlier it had a positive void coefficient. Here, we'll go back to... So I mentioned earlier that it has a positive void coefficient. And the positive void coefficient means that as the water evaporates, the voids that are created by that steam allow for more of the neutrons to get to continue the reaction. Basically, they were using water as its own control rod. It's better to use water as a moderator, which water can be both in an interesting way. Yes, I am pro-nuclear power for South Carolina. I think nuclear power is the future, and there's a long laundry list of reasons. For one, the fuel is relatively cheap. I know we've been talking about how difficult it is to enrich uranium and all of the problems that entails. However, you only need 3% enrichment, 3 to 5% enrichment, and to have uranium that's enriched to 3 to 5%, while being very easily obtainable, a fuel cell or fuel rod lasts for more than a year. So as far as the amount of power that you get out of the fuel that you're creating, it's much cheaper than coal, because you have to continuously mine coal. You have to continuously dig for natural gas and for oil. But uranium lasts for so long that it's so much cheaper in comparison to into anything else that's available. I'm the opposite of George W. Bush. I'll take that as a compliment. I appreciate that. I still stutter on my words from time to time, but it's only because I get excited about what I'm talking about, just because I actually care. But I appreciate that. I think nuclear power is definitely the future. It's safer. There's less deaths overall. Let's see if I can find a Give me a moment. There's a yeah, here you go. This is the image I'm looking for. So here you go. This is the image that I was looking for. This right here, death rates from energy production per terawatt hour. This includes pollution. This shows that brown coal, which is the dirtiest form of coal, is way up there. Is this hundreds of deaths? No. Okay, so it says that there's 32.7 deaths per terawatt hour. Coal is at 24. Oil is at 18. Biomass, which I believe is just biodiesel. And then gas, which is what's sometimes it's becoming more and more popular, and a lot of people are pushing for that. And then here's nuclear, 0.07%. And when you scale up solar and hydropower and wind power, which they are lower on there, when you scale those up to the levels that we would need in order to power the entire country, they overtake nuclear. Now, I couldn't tell you who's dying from wind, hydropower, and solar. Hydropower is more obvious because dams are kind of dangerous to be around, and there are accidents that happen around dams quite often. But in general, they're very safe. The problem with hydropower is it's very difficult to put one wherever you want, because you need the natural environment. You need a river. You need a lake. You need a place where a dam could go. Solar power is great, but it only works 50% of the day. And wind power is great, but you don't get to choose where to put it, and the wind isn't always blowing. Nuclear power, you can install a nuclear power plant anywhere in the world. The nuclear waste that is generated is significantly less than people have been led to believe. The vast majority of nuclear waste is stuff like PPE. It's gloves. It's jackets. It's things that are used at a nuclear power plant. If you have a bag of chips that you get out of the vending machine, you throw that in the trash, and you work at a nuclear power plant, that is considered nuclear waste. Obviously, that's not what people are thinking about when they think about nuclear waste. They're thinking about the big glowing green barrel with green ooze coming out of it. That's not realistic either. The super dangerous nuclear waste is the spent nuclear fuel rods. And we no longer bury those underground in a big mountain somewhere, because it's significantly easier and more practical and makes more sense to sink it into a big bucket of concrete and make it so that it's impossible for any of the radiation to leak out of it, and then just put it under the floor at the nuclear power plant. All of the nuclear waste in the form of nuclear fuel rods is stored on site nowadays, because it makes more sense to store it on site than it would to ship it out through the community on the interstate, where it could get into an accident and something could happen. When we produce so little dangerous nuclear waste per year of operation that the nuclear power plant will likely be retired after 50 to 60 years of operation, or after those 50 to 60 years, it'll have to be updated. And storing the high-level nuclear waste on site would take longer for us to max out the storage capacity of the site than the site would be in operation. So it doesn't make sense to store it in a big mountain somewhere. I mean, you're absolutely right. Based on these stats, HBO should make a show called North Antelope Rochelle Mine. Yeah, the reason that 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima get so many so much attention is because they were big explosive incidents. They were disasters that happened all at once. Now, in Fukushima, there was no... I don't think anybody died from it. I think everybody that died in Fukushima, it was because of the tidal wave that caused the meltdown. I don't think anybody died from the nuclear power plant, or the nuclear reaction itself. And nobody died from 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island was an expensive disaster. There's a series of mistakes that were made that led to one of the reactors. I think that 3 Mile Island has 4 cores, and one of its cores had a meltdown. And that core, so if we go over there, let's go back to here, and I'll explain how this is done. So the cores of nuclear reactors are no longer, they're not built like Chernobyl. Chernobyl was just this exposed, like, there was no containment vessel around it, which is why when it failed so spectacularly. Nowadays, we have a containment vessel. This you could drop a bomb on, and it would be fine. This is extremely thick concrete. Extremely, it's reinforced with rebar. I think it has metal on the inside and a steel. I mean, these things are built insanely. And that the nuclear core that we were discussing earlier, that would be here on the inside of that. So this is where your nuclear core is. So there's a way in and out through here in the form of some sort of a maintenance hatch or of some sort. It depends on the site, obviously, but there's a way in order to add additional fuel and remove old spent fuel cells. What happened in 3 Mile Island is this had a meltdown, and so all of this melted until there was essentially everything down here became filled with the nuclear fuel, at which point, how do you go in there to do repairs? How do you go in there to, once this breaks and you have your meltdown, how do you get inside here to do repairs? Everything in here is extremely irradiated and nothing is contained anymore. So you've basically just got this big shell filled with a bunch of extremely expensive equipment that you can no longer use. That's what happened at 3 Mile Island. Now, there was also a massive misstep with the press. I remember Jimmy Carter showed up on site, and he actually understood nuclear engineering quite well. And he said that it was a big deal for no reason. And the press, people were so afraid of what had happened that anytime somebody got sick, anytime somebody got a cancer, would report it. And the idea was people are getting sick because of 3 Mile Island. When in reality, if you look at the statistics, no ailment from the time of the 3 Mile Island rose statistically above the background rate. So regardless of whether the power plant existed, there's a certain number of people that were going to get cancer. There's a certain number of people that are going to get sick. There's a certain number of people that are going to get injured or feel woozy or die from unexpected causes. The numbers of people that died during the 3 Mile Island incident and the number of cancer diagnoses did not raise above that normal background rate that we would expect to see. But because people were so scared at the time, anything that occurred was blamed on that nuclear power plant. And many of the people that worked for the nuclear power plant did a very bad job at communicating that to the American public. So if anything, it was more of a PR disaster than it was a nuclear disaster. But Chernobyl had it set up. So I spoke about this a little bit earlier. When you have a nuclear reaction, the uranium isotope, will break into two different fission products, is what they're called. It's two different atoms and two different elements that they themselves are also radioactive and will then break down. And this chain continues until you hit to lead, and lead is completely stable, and that's the end. Once something hits lead, you're done. I think iron might also be completely stable, although don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. I could be incorrect. So there's this, during this chain, this breakdown, there's xenon. There's an isotope of xenon that can be generated. And that isotope of xenon occurs roughly 6 hours after the initial fission. So if you split a uranium atom, the fissile material, the fission products will continue to break down and be radioactive on their own. And at one point in that step, you get to xenon. Now, xenon will absorb neutrons. And when it absorbs neutrons, you help kick it onto the next stage where it will continue to fission until it gets to lead. But it takes about 6 hours. So what happened at Chernobyl was they were planning on bringing the reactor down so that they could do a test to see if the momentum of the turbines that were spinning would be enough to power the pumps while the generators sped up. We don't need to go into that too much because it's not that important. They were just basically going to power down the reactor and see how well it worked. However, as they were running it as they were getting ready to run it in low power, they got the call, hey, we have a higher power demand than we originally thought. We need you to beef it up, and you cannot take that core offline because we need its power output. So they were running the core at a much higher power output than they were originally expecting, meaning that they're creating a whole lot more fissions than they were originally expecting. So later, when it was time to run the test and they had powered it down, 6 hours later, they're getting ready to run the test and all of that xenon has built up. And because they're not running at a high capacity like they were earlier, they're not running enough to burn off that xenon. They don't have enough extra neutrons to get rid of all that xenon that's in there. So when they start to power it down to get ready for the test, suddenly it plummets. And that's because all of that xenon is eating all of their neutrons. So they remove all of these control rods. They start to remove the control rods to help speed it up to balance out the xenon. They ended up removing all but 8 control rods from the core, which is terrifying. And that was just to try to keep the reaction from stalling. And because they were just determined to run this test. Because typically if the reactor stalls, you then have to shut the reactor down and you can't use it again for, I think, 24 hours. But it's a long amount of time because you have to let all of that xenon decay naturally on its own. It might be 48, but I don't recall. But in order to try to prevent it from being shut down, they decided to remove all but 8 control rods to burn it off. Once all of that xenon did get burnt off, there was now nothing to stop the nuclear reactor from exponentially increasing in its power output. So all of the water boils to steam. Now that there's no water to prevent the flow of neutrons, because the water acted sort of as a pseudo control rod. Now that there's no water, that's a positive void coefficient. Because the water is gone, now the reaction increases. So now there's no control rods, and there's no water, and the only thing that's available are moderators that help speed up the reaction. So the reactor spikes through the roof. They hit the scram button, which is supposed to drop all of the control rods in all at once as fast as possible. But as I said earlier, the control rods were tipped with graphite. So the bottom half of the control rod was just graphite. So the first thing that enters the core once you hit the scram is graphite, which speeds up the nuclear reactor. And that created so much pressure that it jammed those control rods and kept them from being able to go all the way down where they could snuff out the reaction. And then there was nothing stopping it from it being a complete runaway. So it blew up. It blew up and had a meltdown and was burning for days and days and days. And that was when they got the boron in. They had to pour boron on it in the form of, I believe it was just sand. But American reactors don't have a positive void coefficient. They have a negative void coefficient because American reactors use the water as the moderator. So the water is the thing that's slowing down the neutrons that allow it to be at the appropriate speed to continue the fissile reaction. So if the water goes away, now the neutrons are moving too quickly for the fission reactions to continue. So the reaction slows down until the water comes back and the voids go away. So the more voids you are, the slower the reaction will go, the cooler it will get, and the less voids will be created. They say that some of the nuclear reactors are so safe, kindergartners could operate it. And the only thing that you'd have to worry about is whether or not they stall the reactor. Like, they wouldn't be able to operate it with any sort of efficiency or any sort of skill, but they're not going to cause a nuclear meltdown because they just can't melt down. And there's many different reactor designs out there. I think one of the more interesting ones that's coming out, technology is being worked on, are thorium salt reactors, which use a liquid fuel. So you don't even have to worry about it melting down because you keep the fuel in a liquid state at all times. And the fuel itself is the storage of the heat. So you're basically creating a battery in the form of massive amounts of molten metal. That molten metal is used to heat up the water. And a thorium salt reactor, I think, it's probably the best. It's probably the best form of nuclear power that we're going to come up with. I say that rather boldly. The main issue with thorium salt reactors is that the temperatures involved. We're talking about molten metal. Thorium is what's used as the fuel instead of uranium. And a thorium salt, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but essentially it's a chemical version of the metal. That's not a good description, but it's a kind of the metal. The thorium salt that is being used as your molten metal and your fuel is very corrosive because the temperatures are extremely high. So you're talking about this stuff has to go through pumps, it has to go through pipes, it has to go through machinery. And that machinery has to be able to operate at molten metal temperatures. And as you can imagine, that causes a lot of wear and tear, and stuff that is able to operate at that temperature will still corrode and degrade much, much, much faster than your typical stuff, which means that the maintenance costs are much higher, and it introduces a bunch of other issues. However, they're significantly safer, and you can run the reactor at maximum capacity at all times, because the heat that you're adding to the system is being stored almost like a battery in the form of heat. And as you need more power for the grid, You just allow more water to be boiled, more of that heat to be siphoned off in the form of steam and to turn steam turbines. But the total number of BTUs, the total number of energy that you're holding on to, can continuously increase. Because when we think about a battery, we often think about it in the form of an electric battery, like the battery in your phone, where it's holding on to as many electrons as possible. Well, that energy has been generated by some sort of power plant, whether it's coal or nuclear power or a solar panel or whatever, and then it's been transported through the infrastructure. So it starts at a power plant, it goes through the infrastructure, it ends up in your home, you plug it in, it goes into your device, it goes through transistors and resistors, and finally it gets into your phone, where it's being stored in your battery. And there is a loss at each step of that process. So you're trying to fill a battery with electrons in a very inefficient way. But if you could just store the heat before it even gets turned into electricity, you're essentially you're holding on to energy without it going through those many stages of losses. Those stages of losses will only come up when it's being used. When you're storing the energy, you're just holding it. So holding it in the form of heat makes more sense than holding it in the form of electricity, in the form of an electrical battery, like a lithium-ion battery. And there's an excellent example of power plants that use storing energy in a non-electrical form is a hydroelectric dam. It holds back all of that water, and that water is essentially the battery. And as it needs power for the power grid, it allows that water to spin turbines that are within the dam. So this isn't a new idea, but I think thorium salt reactors are looking very promising. They're not getting nearly the funding that they need, and they've just had some breakthroughs with dealing with the corrosive properties of the metals. I believe they said that it lasts, I think they've done the test and it's been lasting 4 years, and it looks as though their previous methods, it's the equivalent of how their previous method looked after a few months. I mean, you can barely tell that there's any corrosion on it at all. So it does seem like we've made some pretty substantial leaps and bounds. But in order to have access to thorium salt reactor technology, we're going to have to make friends with our European neighbors again, because a lot of the research is being done over in Europe and in the Scandinavian countries, which is all the more reason that we shouldn't be upsetting them with idiotic tariffs. It's annoying, but it is inescapable. Trump's madness has infected just about every aspect of our society and of our world, and the negative influence of his decisions is inescapable. We can't even have a discussion about science without him creeping in somewhere. It's terrible. But does anybody have any questions before we move on? I feel like I've been talking for quite a while. I had somebody that texted me a few questions the other day. They're not related to nuclear energy at all. How should Congress deal with conflicts of interest such as Stephen Miller and Palantir or Trump's endless violations of the Emoluments Clause? I think that's an excellent question. The best way is to never shut up about it. You have to not let them be able to get away with sliding this stuff under the table. Constantly make it your elected representative's problem. Constantly yell at them about it. Tell them that you don't want Palantir to be involved. Because Peter Thiel and Palantir are probably larger threats to the country than Donald Trump. Peter Thiel is actively trying to undermine our democracy and subvert elections in order to get. I mean, he just says so. You can just go. There's a viral video of him. He finally went viral. He finally said something egregious enough that he went viral. I've hated this man for years. But he said, our ideas are never going to win elections, but we can use technology instead of voting. We can use technology to influence elections, and instead of having a platform that's appealing, we can use technology to essentially trick people, is what he's saying. And that video finally went viral, and it's like Peter Thiel is the guy that owns Vance, and he founded PayPal with Elon Musk. Like, he's everything that's wrong with the billionaire class. He's an awful person, and I'm glad that he's finally getting exposed. And Stephen Miller has connections to Palantir, which is Peter Thiel's company, and Peter Thiel has basically owned Stephen Miller as well, I believe. And so Palantir does contracted work for the CIA, and they have all of our data. So all of when Facebook is selling data, they're selling it to people like Palantir, who are then using it to essentially allow the government to spy on you. And it's not the government that's getting that data. It's a billionaire named Peter Thiel that's getting that data. And he gets to essentially decide what the government gets to know and what they don't. He gets to decide. He's allowed to do whatever he wants with that information. It's a terrible situation. Peter Thiel is a horrible person. But you have to constantly make this issue a problem for your elected representative, because as long as they can ignore it and still get reelected, they're going to try to ignore it. So bring it up, spread the word, make sure more people know the name Peter Thiel, make sure more people know what Palantir is. Don't let Trump have all of the glory in the terrible things that are happening. Spread the love around. Let everybody know that these awful players are also in the game. And as far as how Congress can deal with those conflicts, I remember a time when the appearance of impropriety was enough to get a congressman's skin to crawl. And we need to go back to that. We need to have actual punishments for conflicts of interest. We need to have actual punishments. But the first step of doing that, the first step of getting any of that done, is to get rid of the Citizens United decision. We have to overturn the Citizens United decision. Either through legislation that brings it before the Supreme Court again, or by overturning it with a constitutional amendment. But whatever we have to do, we have to overturn the Citizens United decision by any means necessary, or all of this is just going to get worse. What are your thoughts on the big, ugly bill? Which parts are most grievous, and why? There's a lot in that bill that's pretty terrible. I would say the general idea of trying to use a budget bill in order to forward an agenda so that you don't have to get the votes that are required for agenda legislation. Like, regardless of what each individual thing might be. I mean, because there's lots of terrible stuff. They're trying to defund Planned Parenthood. Oh, they want to... They're not allowed to make it illegal to have carbon reduction on automobiles. So basically, they want to make you. We have legislation in place that says you get a penalty for making a car that doesn't meet emission standards. If your car doesn't meet emission standards, you have to pay a fine. And that fine goes to the Treasury. Now, because it goes to the Treasury, they're saying, well, that has to do with... Hey, we got a raid. Hello. Everybody say hello to our raiders. Thank you all for being here. So, what they're claiming is that because the fines for emission standards goes to the Treasury, that's considered part of the budget. And because it's considered part of the budget, that means that they can moderate it in a budget bill. So they've changed the fine to $0. They're not allowed to make it so that there's no fine, but they can change the fine to $0 because that's a budgetary concern. And they've been doing that kind of nonsense with this bill all over. And I think that's horrific. I think that's terrible. Hello to everybody from the raid again. It looks like everybody's finally done piling in here. Good to see you all. Thank you for coming. My name is Kyle Freeman. I'm running for the United States Senate in 2026 against Lindsey Graham. So, pleasure to have you. But the point of the Constitution requiring a 60% vote, I hope I win it too. The whole point of it requiring a 60% vote is to make sure that somebody with a very slim majority isn't going to be able to dictate the entirety of how the country works, that there has to be compromise. And this budget bill is a way of them doing absolutely everything they can to kneecap that idea. And even though there's lots of individual things in it that are terrible, like kicking people off of Medicare and Medicaid and hurting people, hurting people's prospects for a healthy future, there's lots of that. It's the general mindset of it's okay for us to circumvent the Constitution because we want our agenda to come first. I think that's the worst part. It's the thing that's at the core of all of it. It's no one decision. It's the whole mindset that went into the play in the first place. And don't call it a big, beautiful bill. Call it a big, ugly bill. Don't call it the big, beautiful bill. They always name their stuff things like that so that if you argue against it, you sound unreasonable. So don't call it the thing that they are trying to get it to go by. So for those of you who are just joining us, we just wrapped up a conversation about nuclear energy. If anybody has any questions, we can double back there. It says the Constitution is the country. Why are they always trying to subvert it for their own ends? You're absolutely right. I've had to say to people who are pro this administration while also being pro-America, I have to explain to them, you understand, America is the Constitution. America is the American government. Because without the American government, it's just land. Without the ideas behind the Constitution and the philosophy of the Founding Fathers, there is nothing special. America is the Constitution, and following that Constitution and believing that it is designed to bring about the best result is what's gotten us 250 years. So these guys want to subvert it because there's a very small number of billionaires that want short-term gains because in their minds, in the minds of Peter Thiel, if he screws over the American government and the American people and enriches himself and gives Palantir even more power and even more data and all of that, in his mind, if that causes America to fail, he hasn't lost anything because he doesn't have an investment in America. He doesn't actually care about America. He cares about profit. And that's why these... to us, it seems like they're short-sighted and small gains, but to them, they're trading the Constitution and they're trading the country because they don't care about the Constitution or the country. Those are just two things that get in the way of profits in their minds. So we can't rely on them to do the right thing. Their odds are diametrically opposed to what is best for the country. Kissy says, for Republicans, the Constitution is whatever they want, regardless of what the piece of paper says. And it's constitutional what they want, because they're in the right, and they're in the right because it's constitutional. Enter circular logic. Yes, that is correct. Don't bother actually reading the document. It just does whatever we want it to do. And that's the circular logic is especially apparent in the Supreme Court right now. This is the most activist court in American history. They will make an outlandish decision and set a precedent, and then they will cite their own precedent as reasons for overturning something. It's absolutely baffling that the people in Congress aren't doing more to try to address this. I mean, Clarence Thomas should absolutely be removed for corruption. We should be impeaching these judges. Because whether or not we agree with their decisions is irrelevant. The fact that he's taking massive bribes and he's gotten free, like a free RV that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, it's just absurd. It's like comical. And Clarence Thomas and the others are acting like, well, I didn't walk out with a big bag of money with a dollar sign on it that says this money for your court decision, so therefore it's not. It's not corruption. I mean, it's utterly absurd. It says they don't mind sticking an American flag on bills that are against the interests of the people to get it through, though. You're absolutely true. It says, but somehow they only want the patriotism to be to symbols they can stick on things, and not immutable principles. Yeah, you're right. And that's one of the reasons I thought that Trump hugging the flag was so gross, is because it's a meaningless gesture, and if you know about flag culture, it's kind of disrespectful to just go over and hug the flag, but everybody cheered for it because it's just a matter of loving the symbol in the way that you would love a sports team, and I am upset about that. Like I'm angry about it because why does the right get the a monopoly on patriotism? I love this country. I remember the day that I swapped my opinion on this, and I realized how bad it was. I have a shirt with an embroidered. Actually, it's an embroidery that's right here, and it's got a bald eagle with like the American flag going across its face, and it's embroidered on there. And I absolutely love that shirt. And it was made by a family member of mine. And I thank you for the follow. And I went to go put it on, and I hesitated, and I put it back in my drawer because I didn't want somebody to mistake me for a Republican for having the eagle with the flag on it. And then it was a couple days later that I went, wait a minute, no, screw them. They don't get a monopoly on patriotism. Like, I'm allowed to love this country too. I want more USA chants at Democratic events. When Bernie Sanders says that it's time for us to make billionaires pay their fair share and stop getting away with this, we need a USA chant going in his crowd. Let's take it back. They don't get it anymore. If they don't care about the Constitution and they don't have respect for the founding principles of this country, then they don't get to celebrate the flag. Yes, don't cede that ground. Don't let them have it. Wear your American flag with pride. The Supreme Court just today decided that the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional, allowing Trump to end birthright citizenship. Yeah, I saw that. It wasn't that they ended... They decided that the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. They decided that courts... a local injunction does not stop a nationwide decree, essentially, which is stupid, because that essentially means that every single infraction, if they go, well, we're just going to import 10 million people, well, that means that there'd have to be 10 million individual court cases, instead of, and each of those court cases would have to say that it's unconstitutional, instead of one person saying, this is unconstitutional, you have to stop, and then that affecting everything nationwide. Yes, they didn't decide that, they just decided that the universal injunctions were inappropriate, which... if it's unconstitutional, then it's unconstitutional. And if a smaller court finds that it's unconstitutional, obviously that can be appealed, but that should be applied nationwide, because it's like physics. If gravity works in one part of the city, it also works in the other part of the city. If it works in one part of the nation, it's going to work in the other part of the nation. Why is infringing on somebody's rights unconstitutional in South Carolina but wouldn't be unconstitutional in Oregon? It doesn't make any sense. It's absolutely batshit insane ruling, and they only landed on it because they're just trying to increase the power of the executive branch. Yeah, it's so absurd. Kissy, you're absolutely right. It's completely absurd. And it's just an agenda, and they're not even disguising it anymore. They don't even have the common courtesy to pretend like they're trying to be constitutional, which is they should just be impeached. I don't think that there's a long-standing precedent has allowed universal injunctions. The GOP praised the court just a couple hours ago when lower courts put a hold on student loan forgiveness. Yeah, again, it's only a matter of whether or not it moves their agenda forward. If it's what Kissy said earlier, if it's constitutional if it helps us, and if we don't like it, then that means it's unconstitutional. That's how they've defined constitutionality to them. It has nothing to do with legal theory. It has nothing to do with philosophy or precedent. Every lever is just there to be yanked on to suit their needs, and they have no respect for the shoulders they stand on. You're absolutely right. They've been disrespecting this country nonstop since 2016. I mean, once they realized that people would be willing to vote for somebody like Trump, they've gotten extremely bold in how much they're going to violate the Constitution. And I've found that the best way to get through to MAGA supporters isn't to argue against what Trump is doing. It's to explain what the Constitution is and how it works. Because it's the electorate's lack of understanding of civics is the reason that they're allowed to pull this off. If instead of getting into an argument about the merits or about whether or not we should be deporting people or the ethics of it, don't get involved into that conversation, because they don't care. They've made it very clear that they don't care about the ethics. But if you explain to them that what they're doing is illegal and why, and by explaining to them how the Constitution works, that actually gets through to them much more effectively, I've found. It's much easier to win a conservative over to your side by explaining what the Constitution says and how what they're doing is a violation of it, and why the Constitution says it in order to protect you. If you lay those things out, you typically get good reactions from them. It says, to be fair, I hope this amateur attempt to destroy the system at least results in some better safeguards being baked in. Shocked to find so many mechanisms operate broadly just on trust. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I'm running for Senate is because I want to bake those safeties into the system. We need people to go in and bolster all of these things. I was shocked to find out that the Marshals, the U.S. Marshals, didn't work for the court system. I thought they did. I thought that they were the muscle of the judicial branch, but they're not. The judicial branch has to rely on the executive, which that seems like a little bit of an oversight. Maybe we can fix that. Trump tries to follow the Constitution verbatim. I don't believe that that's true. I don't think Trump has read the Constitution, and I think that because there was that time when during his first term, when he came out and he says, there's this thing they've told me about called Article 2. Nobody's ever heard of it, but it basically says I can do whatever I want. Article 2 is literally the second part of the Constitution, guys. That's why it's Article 2. Article 1 outlines, like, the judiciary, and Article 2 outlines the executive branch. I mean, it's just... I don't think he's read the Constitution. Like, I got that he didn't study it in his first term. Like, I knew that he didn't study it and he didn't care. But it wasn't until he started bragging about Article 2 that I realized he actually has never read it. He's actually literally never read the Constitution, and that was shocking. That a president had clearly never read the Constitution. The German Constitution is pretty explicit about a lot of things now. Yeah, should be. We might have some rewrites to do when we get in. I know that one of my goals is to make an amendment to the Constitution that says that bodily autonomy is protected. There shall be no right, or there shall be no law in which infringes upon somebody's decisions involving their own body. So you can't ban tattoos. You can't ban safe medical practices. You can't ban piercings, and you can't mandate these things either. I think that that's a much... One, it's insane to think that we're allowing the government to tell us what we're allowed to do with our own bodies. Period. Like, that's insane on its own. And the fact that women have had to directly deal with that for as long as they have is also insane. But it's time that we take that power away from the government. That's ours. You don't get to make those decisions. We do. And so I'm going to introduce that as a constitutional amendment. Let's see. But yeah, you don't know the vulnerabilities of your system until a destructive force is unleashed upon their ramparts. I mean, that is correct. When I did locksmithing for a little while, I learned about the pen testing world, which is penetration testing, which is where you hire somebody to basically break into your facility. They break into your facility and then they give you a report. These are all of the ways that we could break in. These are all the problems that you have. And it's important to do that. And I mean, hopefully the damage of the Trump presidency only goes as far as a pen test, but we'll see. We've got a lot of good people that are fighting back. Unfortunately, we have a lot of scared cowards that are just capitulating. So yeah, the Equal Rights Amendment, let's see. Oh, fun thing about the German Constitution, starts with basic human rights, and the first 20 articles are anchored and cannot be amended. Nice! I did not know that. That's very cool. It's interesting that ours is done in the Bill of Rights after the establishment of the Constitution. That was actually a lot of... that was very contentious among the Founding Fathers, because they were worried that... I think it was Madison in particular was worried that if you outlined rights within the Constitution, it is then implying that there are no rights other than those. And that you're only allowed to be protected by what's in the Constitution, and everything else is fair game. And he was worried about that, which is why he didn't want the body of the Constitution to contain any rights in it. Which is an interesting article or argument, but it shows how like dead set on making sure people were safe and protected from government that the Founding Fathers were. And it's incredible to see how far away that is now. And to have the people that are damaging our Constitution do so in the name of the flag. It reminds me, I forget who said the quote, I'm sure somebody in chat will let me know. It says, when fascism comes to America, it will come wrapped in an American flag. And it's absolutely what happened. Here we are. The person said that in 1950, and here it is. It's unfortunate, but people are using people's own patriotism against them. The good part about that is that means that the fact that they love the country and the fact that they're patriotic means that they do actually want what's best for the country, even if that's not what's best for their party. And that means that we can win them back. They're not completely lost. He said, when fascism comes to America, it will be disguised as liberalism, Reagan. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think Reagan said that. It says, yep, you wouldn't want them to use a Trojan horse. Article 1 is human dignity is inviolable. Respected and protecting it is the duty of all state authorities. I think that's great. That's a great start. To start with human dignity is it's interesting, but it's subjective. But I like it because it sets a basic standard for. It's sort of like the cruel and unusual punishment is very subjective, but it sets the standard for the kind of stuff that's not tolerated. I like that the human dignity. Because even though it's subjective, it also shows everything should be on that side of the equation. There shouldn't be anything that's in the gray area over here. It should all be clearly balanced towards human dignity. Oh, Reagan did say that on 60 Minutes. Well, he's stealing the quote from somebody else. There was a writer who said that it would when fascism comes to the United States, it's going to come draped in an American flag. But I can't remember who said it. Sinclair. I think that's right. I think, yeah, that sounds right. When fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. That's the full quote. But yeah, he's right. I mean, that's essentially what we've. It's misattributed to Sinclair. All right, chat, fight it out. You're gonna have to fight it out because I have to move on. We can't sit here talking about this quote for 20 minutes. But the sentiment is the point that matters. We've got people that are coming in saying if you love this country, you're going to give the executive branch more power, which is exactly the opposite of what the Constitution was going for. Yeah, exactly. Not worth it. They made a good point. Whoever said it. Whoever said it, it doesn't matter. It's the sentiment that matters. But Trump's shown up and he said, "Hello, not much. We're doing we just had a big long discussion about nuclear energy, and we've moved on to we're just sort of hanging out now. What's up with you?" The known dark Senate. As said, it's unclear if he ever said it, but it does sound like something he would say. The quote I posted is from Sinclair Lewis Society at Illinois State. The primary election is... last time I checked it, they hadn't announced the actual date of the primary election, but the general is in November of 2026, and the primary is in earlier that year, 2026. I play a little bit of D&D. I don't play a lot. I haven't played lately. I used to play when I was younger. Yeah, nuclear energy is a super important issue. We broke down a lot of what nuclear enrichment entails, and I suppose we can tread over some of it again. But we broke down a lot of what nuclear enrichment is, like uranium enrichment in particular. To quickly go over it once more, when you enrich uranium, there's two different kinds of uranium atoms that are relevant to the conversation. They're uranium isotopes. There's uranium-235 and uranium-238. Uranium-238 is the vast majority of the uranium that's out there. In fact, let's go and take a look. So you've got... Here. There we go. Uranium-235 and uranium-238. There's your two different kinds of uranium. I drew this out last time, and it was far messier than... This is cleaner. Uranium-235 is the good stuff. Uranium-235 is what we want. Uranium-238 is essentially useless. There's not much that we can do with it. You'd guess I'm 33. I am 35, sir, but I appreciate the compliment. I'll take it as a compliment. Maybe AI companies will be the force that speeds up new nuclear generation capacity. That would be fantastic. It would be useful. Although, honestly, when you think about it, AI is only slightly more powerful than the human mind, and the human mind doesn't require nearly as much energy. So I feel like what's most likely going to happen is we're going to have newer generations of AI that are going to run more efficiently and not use massive data harvesting in order to operate. I think the AI technology is continuing to evolve. But hey, if they want to continue to pump money into it, let's bring them to South Carolina. They can pump the money in over here. Thank you, I appreciate that. Saying that I'm still young and we need politicians our age. I agree. There's far too many old people that are in power. Chuck Grassley is running for re-election, and he's 91. He's 91 right now, and the election is in 2026, which means that he will be at a minimum of 92 when the election happens, which means that at the end of his Senate term, if he wins, he will be a minimum of 98, which is crazy. So we need more young people in here. We need more young people with fresh ideas, people that don't have to learn all of this technology from scratch. So uranium-238. Uranium-238 is not useful as far as a fissile material goes. But the issue is that uranium-235 equals 0. What the heck? You're supposed to be a brush. It equals 0.7% of all of the uranium atoms that are in a sample, and uranium-238, which isn't useful, is 99%. I'm writing with a mouse, so please forgive me. I should get that touchpad tablet out. I'll do it later. So when we talk about enriching uranium, what we're actually talking about is getting rid of these uranium-238s and finding as many uranium-235s. But we're talking about separating uranium atoms from other uranium atoms. So it's like finding a needle in a needle stack. It's extremely difficult to do. Let's see. DC and politics in general are becoming senior citizens' homes at taxpayers' expense. Yeah. Here is a list of all current U.S. senators under the age of 40. John Ossoff. So, yes, you can eat uranium-238, but don't, because it does give off alpha particles, and while it's not extremely radioactive and it's not highly dangerous, the alpha particles that it does give off that is ionizing radiation. You can hold on to uranium-238 all you want, and it's not going to hurt you, because uranium-238's fissions are alpha particles, which are essentially a helium nucleus. Yeah, you can technically eat anything. There are just some things you can only eat once. You're technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. Alpha particles are super bad, but cannot make it through skin. Yeah, correct. That's exactly it. An alpha particle penetrates air and atmosphere for, I think, about 6 inches, and it's not just that your skin blocks it; it's that the dead layers of your skin block it, so it doesn't actually get to living cells because its inability to penetrate stuff. I actually have a uranium sample right above me. I've been collecting a sample of every element on the periodic table for the past few years, and I try to do something interesting with them, and my uranium sample is above me. And it's perfectly safe to keep it there, but I still have it in a lead box surrounded with tinfoil. Just for the stray beta particle that might come off of it. So back to enriching uranium. Yes, back to enriching uranium. The problem with enriching uranium is that when you have 99% of it is stuff that you can't really use for fission, and less than 1% of what's left over is the good stuff, then the issue that you run into is scale. The only way to get a usable amount of uranium is to go at scale, and that's one of the reasons that the one you have is yttrium. I don't have yttrium yet, so I am jealous of you. When we say, nuclear inspectors are going to go in and make sure that they're following the rules, inspectors are going to go in and make sure that they're not enriching uranium too much, a lot of times detractors will argue that they're just going to hide the uranium enrichment, but you're talking about a warehouse-sized building that has a huge power draw. It would be like trying to hide a Google server farm. Like, it's a heat signature that you can see from space, so it's very difficult to hide these things. And the way that this enrichment basically happens is there's a big tube like this, and the uranium will come in through a pipe, and this tube, not in general, they're not generally, the centrifuges themselves are not energy intensive, but you have to heat the stuff up to the point that it's melting and gaseous. There's a series of chemical reactions. You're not just taking uranium rock and throwing it into the centrifuge. You have to turn it into a gas through chemical means, and that's where a lot of the energy stuff comes from. Now, the energy output that you get from a nuclear power plant is significantly larger, but it's not on par with its energy output is not on par with, let's say, a Google server farm, but the size of the building and the scale of it is no Google. I'm not trying to talk to you. Shut up. The scale of the building is the size of one of those facilities. It's like a warehouse. It's like try to hide a warehouse, essentially. Yeah, hexafluoride or whatever it is. You are correct. It is hexafluoride. That is the gas that they've combined it with. So the uranium goes in through a tube here, and there's a big centrifuge that spins, and so all of the useful uranium, or the useless uranium, in theory, will congregate over here on the sides as it spins in the chamber. Because uranium-238 is heavier. It has more neutrons on it. It has 3 more neutrons on it. That's why it's called uranium-238. So because it's heavier, it'll congregate on the side, and then you scrape off and suck up the uranium that you actually want to use. The uranium-235 gets pulled up through here. And this comes out and into another series of centrifuges. Now, this process is going to yield a lot of uranium-238 along with the uranium-235, just by necessity, because you're talking about individual atoms here. Yeah, and a mile-deep football field is an expensive football field. Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're not something that you can hide underground. It's not something that you can do in an apartment building. It's not something that you can put into a cave. These are massive buildings that require complex engineering and infrastructure. It's saying that they're going to hide it in the city would be like saying that you're going to hide an aircraft carrier at a jet ski parking lot. Like, somebody's gonna notice. But this is the process for enriching uranium. In general, we've skipped a lot of steps. Okay, if somebody was actually working on it, they would be offended at how much we've skipped. But if you're doing this, you're gonna need dozens, if not hundreds, of these centrifuges in order to do it, to enrich uranium at any rate that would be significant. Hundreds to thousands of them hidden was always much more brash than people made it seem. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, so it's not hexafluoride, but rather the fluorine forms uranium hexafluoride. Yes, uranium hexafluoride is the chemical that's put into the centrifuges. So, I lost my train of thought. Yes, you're going to have dozens, if not hundreds of these, and it's not like you can put one in somebody's house and be like, no, that's my really strange water heater. Don't pay any attention to that, because all of that infrastructure has to be connected to one another. And the uranium gets extremely hot, and it has to then be cooled before it can be turned back into a solid product. It's very complex. You need an entire facility in order to do any step of it. And the idea of them hiding hundreds of thousands of these things where nobody will find them is utterly absurd. Now, when it comes to the enrichment of uranium, the percentages that you're looking for are, yay, there's 3 to 5%. I've decided that my handwriting's bad enough that I'm just going to type the stuff out. And there's 85 to 90%. So 3 to 5% is what you would want for a nuclear fuel rod. And 80 to 90% is what you would want for here, we'll use this one. For an explosion. That is weapons grade. 80 to 90% is weapons grade, and 3 to 5% is a nuclear fuel rod. I bet there's some alley in Shenzhen where they're sorting uranium isotopes by hand like it's nothing. You know, that's actually interesting. That was one of the things we talked about. Not Shenzhen specifically, but we specifically haven't been investing in newer, better, easier ways to refine uranium because the difficulty of refining uranium is one of the things that keeps bombs out of the hands of small groups. So if somebody were to come up with a way to turn uranium-238 into uranium-235, so you could just make the isotope that you wanted out of any uranium that you had, and if that could be done in somebody's apartment, then it would be extremely difficult to stop somebody from being able to build a bomb, because anybody that could buy any amount of uranium could essentially make a nuclear weapon. That's terrifying. So in order to prevent that reality, countries have purposefully not been researching the technology to refine uranium to make it more efficient. Oh yeah, Al-Qaeda would have already made one of those and used it, if so. Precisely. So we've specifically not been studying the uranium enrichment process because the difficulty of getting uranium is the reason that people don't have bombs. When they talk about Iran being 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb, Iran's uranium was enriched to 60%. So they had 60% enrichment. Now, that is far too much to make a nuclear fuel rod, but it's not nearly enough in order to make something that's weapons grade. So, however, 60% enrichment is around 90% of the effort that you need, because in order to get the rest of the enrichment, the process becomes significantly simpler. And it says Iran has been weeks away since 1989. And what they mean by that, so AI will tell someone how to make it in a microwave with a coat hanger in 6 months' time anyway. They got caught with 80-something percent material and said, oh no, we did that on accident. Did that happen? Iran got caught with 80%. I haven't heard about that if that's the case. But as far as I know, Iran had 60%, and they've been oh, interesting. I'll have to look into that. I'm gonna have to learn more about that. That I missed that somehow. CJLJ2K followed us. Thank you for the follow. And thank you for the known Dark Senate for following as well. And here's to Promise. Thank you all for the follow. Appreciate it. Thank you all for showing up. If you get Chat GPT to make a nuclear weapon, I'm sure the FBI has the tools to find you before you make it. Well, here's the thing. You don't have to ask ChatGPT how to make a nuclear weapon because the schematics and the blueprints to make a nuclear weapon can be found with Google image search. The actual technology behind making a nuke isn't difficult at all. It's getting your hands on 85 to 90% enriched uranium that's the problem, because you need the infrastructure of a government in order to pull it off. And that's why we haven't been developing uranium enrichment, is because it keeps it out of the hands of randos and out of the hands of most governments. But when they say Iran is 2 weeks away from having what they need to make a nuke, what they mean is if they were to dedicate 100% of their infrastructure to finishing this 60% enrichment to this 85 to 90% enrichment in order to have enough enrichment, weapons-grade uranium to make a bomb, that process would generally take 2 weeks. But Iran was clearly not doing that because they were sitting there on that 60% enrichment for decades. So while it's not necessarily false to say that Iran was 2 weeks away from having a nuclear weapon, Iran was not doing any of the steps that needed to be done for that 2-week process. And if they were to do it, it would likely have not taken 2 weeks. They would likely take several months because they would want to do the entire stockpile of uranium, which was about 400 kilograms. It was more than 400 kilograms. They would want to do the entire stockpile at once, not just enough to make a bomb. So it's simultaneously technically true while being very misleading. Any it wasn't 60%. It says it was a small amount and it was inadvertent and they didn't hide it, etc. But it shows how close they are. Yeah, for sure. It wasn't 60% already well past any non-fusion usage, though. I thought they were just doing the research isotopes or medical, but I was behind. Yeah, the thing is, I don't know why they have the 60%, because it's relatively useless. It's also important to remember that Iran is not our friend. They do not like us, and this is a country that we would not want to have nuclear weapons. But they haven't been making nuclear weapons. They've been enriching uranium, and they have a nuclear program, but they haven't been making nuclear weapons. So I don't know why they want 60% enriched uranium. I have a couple theories. And not to say that it's entirely useless, but as far as nuclear power goes, whether it's nuclear power that's released all at once or in a power plant, as far as that goes, I don't know why they want the 60% enrichment. But, and by the way, it's not fusion, it's fission. It's just a technical thing. Fusion, and I only say that because there's lots of new research that's being done on nuclear fusion. And they're just powering up that new... I forget what it's called, so never mind. I'll Google it later. We can talk about fusion later. They've had a breakthrough, but they're still a while away. A fission bomb. Yeah, a fission boom. Yes. Remember who declared Iran a major enemy of the United States and then sold them rockets and warheads. The thing is, Iran wasn't interested in making a nuke. They made it very clear that they weren't interested in having nuclear weapons. They were only interested in having a nuclear program for whatever reason. And then we bombed them, giving them a really good reason to make a nuclear weapon. Like, we've put ourselves in a horrible situation that now we have to diffuse. And that's been Trump's presidency so far, is he gets the country into a horrible situation. He half-assedly gets us most of the way out of it, and then goes, look at how great I am at solving all of these problems. But there's a difference between fission and fusion. And fission is the splitting of the atom, and fusion is combining of the two atoms. Nuclear power is super valuable. The problem is, especially for an oil-producing company, or country, rather, nuclear fuel and nuclear power is extremely powerful, but they can't use 60% enriched uranium. I suppose the process of making enriched uranium less enriched is probably significantly less difficult. Diluting the uranium is probably less difficult. So making a nuclear power or a nuclear fuel rod out of 60% enriched uranium is likely a simple task. If there's a scientist out there that knows the answer to that question, you can yell at me in the chat or the comments, but I would imagine that it's less difficult. But the difference between a nuclear power plant and a nuclear bomb is, and I did this demonstration earlier, we will do it again, because I think that this is a great way of explaining it. So if you split this atom, because you have uranium-235, uranium-238 splits into, it gives off an alpha particle and it becomes a thorium atom, but it cannot fission. Uranium-235 fissions, which means it splits in half and becomes two different atoms. Which I suppose technically, given uranium-238 giving off the helium atom as an alpha particle, is technically fissioning into two different atoms. But we're moving on. says, yeah, getting up to 60% is weird, but there's perfectly normal, rational reasons Iran would want to get into nuclear power. Yes, and in fact, Iran having a nuclear deterrent in the form of a nuclear bomb while being surrounded by Israel and several other unstable Middle Eastern non-allies, it would make sense to say, get off my land, or get off my lawn, I have a nuke. Even if that nuke never gets used, it's just the fact that they have the option. So there's a reasonable, non-violent, like path to peace kind of argument for Iran having nuclear weapons, and I'm not against the idea of Iran having a nuke for their own protection, but I think it's a better path to peace for there to not be nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and for us to find a different path to peace and not have to rely on having guns pointed at each other for us to not kill each other. Like, there can be economic... no one is talking about invading or bombing North Korea right now. And North Korea isn't talking about going to war with us or trying to blow us up. It's very much a mutual, if you leave me alone, if you mind your own business, I'll mind my own business. And I feel like there's a lot of... There's ways to peace that don't involve having loaded guns pointed at everybody's head. But that doesn't have to do with the fissioning of uranium. So when uranium fissions, it gives off 3 neutrons. And so those 3 neutrons... Whoa. Those 3 neutrons will shoot out. And if they hit another uranium atom, that uranium atom splits. And it gives off 3 neutrons. Now, this is where, if you have it set up like this, where all of these are the uranium-235, and when this splits, and this goes over here, and this splits, this goes over here, and this splits, each of these will go and split all of those, and you get this exponential increase where, and that's how a bomb works. That's a nuclear bomb, is each of these parts, each of these neutrons hitting another atom, which gives out 3 neutrons, and you get this runaway effect, and it gives off a massive amount of energy. And that's energy in the form of E equals mc squared. So the amount of energy that's given off is equivalent to the amount of mass that's used, or that's converted directly into energy, because there is mass that's lost and turned into energy when fission occurs. And that energy is equal to the amount of mass times the speed of light squared. That's what E equals mc squared means. And it says, oh wait, we did that and Trump voided it? Yes. We had an Iran nuclear deal that would basically say, hey, Iran, you can have a nuclear program where you can, create nuclear-producing items for, like, medicine and research and X-rays and all of that, and you can enrich uranium for the purposes of nuclear power plants, but we're going to limit your capacity so that you don't make a bomb. And Trump pulled us out of that. But something that should be noted is that there are a few, while they did violate the rules of that quite a few times, they were still abiding some of the rules of the Iran nuclear deal even after Trump pulled us out, which makes it even more absurd and insane that we bombed them. Yeah, but we all get to come in and make sure you're not messing around. Yeah, and as we established earlier, it's extremely difficult to hide one of these facilities. These facilities are massive. So the inspectors can come in and go, like, we want to look around and make sure that you're not breaking the rules. And they have to let them in. That was part of the rule. Yeah, yes, that's because the EU and other joint partners were still trying to hold the deal as well. Which you're correct. They weren't doing it solely out of the goodness of their own heart, but it's important to note that us bombing them wasn't because they were like, now that the Iran nuclear deal is gone, we can do whatever we want. They weren't going on like a rampage. it was essentially unprovoked. And even though Iran is not our ally, it should still be noted that what we did is kind of crazy. Oh, screw Norton. Don't get Norton. Norton's a virus. It's terrible. My 3-year-old son got onto my computer, and he installed a bunch of games, and he installed WhatsApp. I don't know how. He's just hitting random buttons on here. And so I've been slowly trying to remove everything that he did while he was playing around pretending to be me on the computer. So apologies for the interruption. The nuclear was just an excuse for the reason that they sent people to kill Trump and several others, and I'm sure they're connected them to October 7th. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about there. Was an excuse for the reason they sent people to kill Trump and several others. Okay. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about, but we're going to move on. So this is a nuclear bomb. And if you do the same reaction, but with if you put in what are called control rods, which we can put at the top and the bottom here, then what will end up happening is these neutrons will get eaten up by the control rod while this neutron continues forward. And that hits another uranium atom, which splits, and 2 neutrons get eaten up, and they eat another uranium atom, and so on and so forth, and we can continue the process in a slow and sustained way. And this is what a nuclear fuel rod looks like, at least the reaction. This is grossly simplified, obviously. But if we can keep a steady amount of reactions going instead of an exponential increase, then we can control the amount of energy that a nuclear reactor is giving off, and we can keep it sustained for an extremely long amount of time. And this is the concept behind a nuclear reactor. And if you want more power, you need to have less neutrons captured by the control rods, so you can remove the control rods. And now you'll get a stronger reaction. And now you have, for every 1 uranium, you're getting 2. And once you get the reaction stabilized to the point that that's the level you want it to be at, you can put the control rods back in and keep it there and have it reach equilibrium. This is the idea behind a nuclear fuel rod. So by the way, we're going to be wrapping this up for a little soon. We've been going for 2 hours, and I want to thank everybody here for listening to me talk. I do think that this is all really interesting, so I'm glad you're all joining me with it. But this is a nuclear fuel rod, and this is by increasing and decreasing the amount of control rods, the amount of neutrons that are being absorbed, you can increase and decrease the total power output by increasing the amount of heat that the fuel rod is generating. And that heat is then used to boil water, and that water is turned into steam and powers steam turbines. And that is nuclear power in a nutshell. And that's the difference between nuclear power as a fuel rod versus an explosion and a bomb. You need a much higher concentration of uranium-235 for a bomb, because it needs to be packed together to create what's called critical mass, so that once that chain reaction starts, it essentially fissions all atoms involved. Well, if your uranium isn't critical mass, then the neutrons go too fast to hit other nuclei. The control rods just dope the neutrons, but the water mostly slows the neutrons down to make them more likely to hit other neutrons. That is true for American reactors, in which water is used as a moderator. The moderator helps to slow down the neutrons so that they can be used by, well, not used, but they can fission the atoms. A way of thinking about it is that the neutrons are coming out extremely fast, too fast to actually be useful, and we have to slow them down. And there are some reactors that use moderators to sort of have them bounce off and then become active. And then there are other American reactors use water. And by using water as a moderator, you get what's called a negative void coefficient, which means that the more voids created by steam and bubbling that you have, the slower the reaction will come. So if you suddenly flash boil all of the water away, the reaction dies, and you don't have to worry about a thermal runaway. Just mentioning that the U.S. Navy has been safely operating nuclear-powered submarines and ships for decades. It's a safe form of power. It absolutely is. In fact, if I'm not, I have not operated a nuclear sub, so if I'm wrong, I apologize. But as far as I understand, the nuclear reactors in a submarine are actually not capable of having a meltdown. They're physically incapable of producing enough energy all at once to have a meltdown. So if you work on a nuclear sub, you're actually trained to focus more on not overpressurizing the pumps and the steam apparatus than you are on worrying about the temperature of the core, which I think is really interesting. And you're absolutely right. It's an extremely safe form of power. And Kissy is also right that the control rods dope the neutrons, but a moderator is required in order for the neutrons to be useful. I skipped that part because it's an added form of complexity. And the RMK reactors that happened at Chernobyl, hang on. Fun fact, the 3 Mile Island reactor incident was caused by a nuclear sub-trained personnel making decisions that make sense for closed atmospheres, but not for nuclear reactors that are in the open. That is correct. They were trained under no circumstances do you allow the system to overpressurize, and no matter what you do, it doesn't matter if the core goes just do not let the system overpressurize, which makes sense because if you overpressurize in a submarine, you blow up and you're at the bottom of the ocean. So that's super bad. And if you're running a nuclear reactor that cannot have a meltdown, of course they wouldn't want you to worry about the temperature of the core. But in the 3 Mile Island, where it's a significantly larger reactor, and the reactor is absolutely capable of having a meltdown and destroying the equipment, the people that were trained on a nuclear sub were doing exactly what they were trained to do and making absolutely sure that the system didn't overpressurize. And they did a lot of things that ended up making the problem worse. In specific, they created this backup that created a water hammer that just destroyed the system and prevented them from being able to halt the meltdown at that point. There's a lot of things that went wrong. If you have the opportunity to look into it, look into what happened like second by second at the 3 Mile Island incident. It's really fascinating stuff from an engineering standpoint. And Kissy is absolutely correct. The 3 Mile Island reactor incident was caused by nuclear... I wouldn't say it's caused by, but it was one of the factors. Because there's a way of looking at it where it's somebody's fault, and then there's another way of looking at it that there's a series of mistakes. Everybody involved was doing the absolute best they could and doing exactly what they were trained to do. These guys were doing their job. The system around them had failed, allowing them to, while trying to do their best job, make the wrong decisions. And those have since been fixed. There were so many slices of Swiss cheese that could have stopped the incident. You're absolutely right. And that the Swiss cheese model is this concept of a series of layers of protection. Each of those layers of protection will have holes in it. And those holes, if they line up, are how you get an accident. And so you want to make sure that the holes in your Swiss cheese never line up. And the guys were, not training updated, and that led to their poor choices. Yeah, because the people that hired them just went, oh, they have experience on a nuclear sub, that should be all they need, not realizing, not checking with the training that they had received to know that the training that they had received would be different than operating the reactor at 3 Mile Island. These are all mistakes that have been fixed, and we've improved the engineering overall. But it is not the fault of the individuals that were operating the thing. It's a fault of a cascading series of minor things that all added up to creating the issue. And nobody died from it. There were no deaths, which is awesome, and people don't talk about that nearly enough. We brought up this. We brought up this earlier. Um, uh, we brought up this. This is the chart for how safe nuclear power is compared to other forms of energy in the firm's death rate per terawatt hour. And this is based on deaths from accidents and air pollution from per terawatt hour. You can see brown coal is obviously the worst. Mining coal is extremely dangerous, and it's very pollution heavy. Coal follows that up. I would personally combine both of those into one because I don't think we should bother distinguishing the two. That's just my opinion. There's fine arguments for making the distinguishment. Oil is extremely high up there. Obviously, we've seen everything from Exxon Valdez to Deepwater Horizon as major incidents, but then there's also the incidents of massive amounts of smog that have been caused that create deaths. It's extremely bad in areas like Cairo, where the air pollution is intense. Biomass, I believe, is referring to stuff like biodiesel and stuff, and gas, I believe, is referring to natural gas. As you can see, natural gas compared to these is definitely better, and that's been more on the rise. A lot of people have been making the argument, like, you already have a gas stove, you should use gas to power the rest of your house. Which is fine, but Deepwater Horizon was looking for... was fracking, and fracking is one of the main ways that they're trying to get more and more natural gas. And then here's nuclear, 0.07%. Or 0.07 deaths per terawatt hour. And that's every nuclear accident, that's every exposure to radiation, that's all of it. Coal causes more deaths than radiation than nuclear. It's not just that coal causes more deaths than radiation and nuclear. Coal causes more deaths than the mining of uranium, the refinement of uranium, the proliferation of uranium, the creation of plutonium, which is plutonium is all made in a lab. It's everything. It's all combined. If you include all of the damage that was done by Chernobyl, and if you are completely ruthless in your statistics in trying to make nuclear power look as bad as possible, it still blows the competition out of the water. And when you scale these numbers up to say what we would need them to be if we were to power the entire country with it, nuclear starts to outpace wind and solar and hydropower. Now, all of these have their downsides. These downsides, the ones at the top, deaths. We can move on. Down here, the downside to solar is that it's not always sunny, and that solar panels are kind of expensive per terawatt hour. That having been said, it's relatively cheap for an individual to install them on their roof. I have solar panels on my roof as well. And so solar panels are a great way of doing it. However, the fact that the sun isn't out all of the time means that this is a good supplement, a good auxiliary, but it's not a good primary source of power. Then there's hydroelectric power, like a hydroelectric dam. And hydropower is great because you can store... You build this dam and you have this massive storage of water. That water is essentially a battery, and as you need more power, you just let more water go through. You're storing up all of that energy. Instead of storing it in the form of electrons, you're storing it in the form of all of this water. The problem there is you can't just go into downtown Columbia and build a hydroelectric dam. You can only build them where the terrain permits, and it alters that terrain. So if there's a neighborhood nearby and you want to flood that neighborhood in order to make a dam, you're going to have a bunch of angry people at you. You can't just build a dam anywhere. There's only very specific places where you can build a dam and it works. So hydroelectric power, while being excellent, is very limiting in how much you can build and how many dams you can make. Then there's wind power. It's not always windy, and they're very expensive, and the more that you build, the less efficient they tend to be overall. Although the drop is relatively minor, on a massive scale, the drop becomes significant. But when you see like a wind farm, they're not hurting each other. Nuclear is the only one that you could like build in downtown Columbia and use it to power everything, and there not be an issue. You can build a nuclear power plant essentially anywhere. A lot of people like to have it near a source of water, but that is not necessary. You can, and it's useful, but it's not necessary to have a natural body of water near it. We have a nuclear power plant that is hooked up to a man-made lake because there are no natural lakes in South Carolina. All of South Carolina's lakes are man-made. So any nuclear power plant that we have that is using water from a lake is using it from a man-made lake, and you don't have to have access to that lake for the system for a nuclear power plant to function. It is super convenient though, but that means you can put a nuclear power plant anywhere. And its fuel, once you load it up with fuel rods, the fuel lasts for about a year and a half. So once you make that fuel rod, you get it for a really long time. When you burn coal, it only lasts for minutes while it's burning. Once you've burned it, you're done. And then you have to go mine more coal. Nuclear fuel rods last for an extremely long amount of time, and compared to how much power they put out, they are very cheap. Nuclear power is excellent. It is definitely the future, and it's what we should be focusing on. Nuclear power is excellent. There is one natural occurring nuclear reactor in history. That is true! I found out about that not too long ago. I learned about that a few months ago. It was... Oh, there's the details. Oklo Gabon, West Africa. This is a natural reactor. It operated over 2 billion years. A geological phenomenon where nuclear fission reactions occur naturally. It's something about the way that the... here, we'll erase this real quick. It's something about the way that the ground works. So, this is going to be a rather crude representation, so forgive me. But I believe that there's water that's flowing down through an underground uranium a uranium deposit. There's like uranium ore all through here, and this uranium ore is heating this up, and as this water starts to boil away, it kills the reaction. And it's this weird setup where you just happen to have all of the elements of a nuclear reactor in the right spot where you get the fission reaction going. And as it boils that water away, it creates voids, and it has a positive void coefficient. So the more voids that it makes... or no, I think it has a negative void coefficient. I don't remember. But yes. Yeah, they got some uranium out of a mine, and it demonstrated properties of having been in a nuclear reactor, and everybody freaked. Yeah, absolutely. It's just a really cool... It's like everything fell down and stacked on top of each other in the exact order that you needed it to be in order for it to work. It's just a very neat thing that happened. Obviously, it's not impossible, but the odds are very low, and it's cool. Sometimes it's fun to just be giddy about cool stuff. Yeah, they have nuclear power plants all over France. Europe was doing a great job about being very pro-nuclear power. They changed that. Germany started to deconstruct a bunch of their nuclear power plants, which is a shame, because the upfront cost is huge. So, the upfront cost of nuclear power, we'll say, is about here. And the upfront cost of coal is down here. But coal has to continue to mine those resources over and over again. But once uranium is done, uranium can... That's way too small for this example. Uranium takes 1 resetting of fuel every year and a half. So if the amount of colored in blocks is the cost, you can see that coal quickly starts to outrun coal, natural gas, oil, all of these I'm sort of lumping in together. These are all fossil fuels. You can see how the longer that fossil fuels run compared to nuclear power, the less efficient they are. And the more expensive they are. The upfront cost for a nuclear power plant is intense, but the sustainability cost is really low. So the best thing to do for a nuclear power plant is to build as many as possible and then keep them as running as long as possible. And then, because then your cost of energy essentially goes down to zero, especially once you've paid back all of the loans, it becomes essentially pure profit. It's extremely intelligent to invest in nuclear power. It's not as intelligent to invest in fossil fuels because you have that high upfront cost, but you also have a high sustained cost. That's why we're constantly relying on nuclear power, or not nuclear power, on oil prices by barrel and all of that. It's because you have to constantly upkeep this perpetual cost of getting this stuff out of the ground. Germany freaked out from Fukushima. Yeah, they freaked out over Fukushima, which is a shame. We've shut down all our plants by now. Yeah, I feel bad, and I'm a little angry at Germany, because the best thing to do is to build nuclear power plants and keep them running as long as possible, and they built their nuclear power plants and then shut them down early, which is like the exact opposite of what you're doing. They didn't even get the chance to make their money back from it. So it's really a shame. And all it basically took was CDU, CSU joining up with the Green Party to get it done. It's a shame. We need more nuclear power in this country. And here's the best part, is a lot of the infrastructure, what is being used in a coal power plant or in natural gas is they burn all this product in order to boil water. That water goes to turn steam turbines. Those steam turbines then generate the electricity. With a nuclear power plant, you're using nuclear fission in order to boil water, and then that boiled water is going to turn steam turbines, and those steam turbines generate power. Well, other than the nuclear power part, everything else is the same. You're either burning fossil fuels or you're using a fission reaction. So, in theory, we could go over to those old coal plants, those old fossil fuel plants, and just use the infrastructure that already exists there. Because they already have the steam turbines, they already have a way to boil the water, they already have a way to get the steam turbines hooked up to the power grid and all of that. And you can just retrofit that to, instead of burning fossil fuels, you're using nuclear power, and you take off a big chunk of the initial cost of your nuclear power, making it even cheaper, making it an even better idea. Nuclear power is definitely the future. It's hands down the way for us to go, and we need to invest in it more. And I'm running for United States Senate. I'm absolutely intending on investing more in a nuclear power, and I want to bring nuclear power here to South Carolina. I want high-quality, high-paying jobs that allow us to have cheap energy. It's a really good idea. Well, I'm gonna get ready to wrap it up. I know I said that like probably 20 minutes ago, but we're gonna actually do it now. Thank you all for coming. I'm Kyle Freeman. I'm running for United States Senate in South Carolina in 2026, going up against Lindsey Graham. Interesting. What's your stance on the term, this is a Wicklow classic? It's a term that's going around in the Norfolk area of Virginia within politics, but I'm not sure of the context. I've never heard of it before either, but I grew up in Virginia Beach, which is right next to Norfolk in Virginia. And Madam Hooch, yes, I'm still angry about SCNG canceling the nuclear power plant that they were planning on building. I'm still upset about that. And D at T followed me. Thank you for the follow. Appreciate it. Again, my name's Kyle Freeman. I'm running for United States Senate in South Carolina. Thank you all for being here today. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on social media. You can also go to my website at kyle4sc.com. I'm going to put the link in the chat. There you go. There's our website for you. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad I could talk about all of this. And hopefully it gives you guys some context for everything that's going on in the news right now with Iran and all of that. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. And thank you for the raid as well. Y'all have a good one. Bye.